Good morning, Oz.
Good morning, Richard. How are you today?
I am great. How are you?
Not bad at all, cheers. So it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to have you on today. You're one of the all-time leaders in your variety of fields. For those that don't know who you are, Richard, how would you describe yourself when people ask you what you do?
I always say that I'm an investor and a writer, an author, which is largely true. So that's what I do. I have been an entrepreneur once, in the sense that I was actually co-founder of a consulting business. And I like to describe myself as an entrepreneur, but it's not really true, because the people who are doing the hard work are the people who are actually running a company. So I do the easier thing, which is to select and invest in companies. But I'm a very active investor, a very close colleague in a way of the people who are actually running the business. Not that I get in their way, but I do think about the business and talk to them about it. And so I think that's it's a very gratifying thing to be able to do that occasionally. And those guys, all the guys who are running my companies, I'd like to dedicate this podcast to them. Oz, would you like to tell us just a little bit about yourself so that the listeners know who's asking me the questions?
Sure. So, first and foremost, a family man, happily married with 2 girls. Then over the last 20 years, I've been doing business consulting and strategy. First 10 years of my career with a big consulting firm. The last 10 years have been focused more on healthcare and strategy. That's helping both big and small firms. I also do lecturing and coaching and have a real interest in achievement and enterprise. Also an aspiring author, where I've been writing a book of late with the same title as my podcast, Unobtainium.
Great. Okay, well, let's see if we can be unobtainium in this particular interview. What would you like to ask me?
To warm us up, can we do some quickfire questions?
Yes, the answers might not be quickfire, but the questions can be.
All right, super. Cheers. Thanks. So you're trapped on a desert island and you have a choice of 3 things. It can't be people. What would they be?
Oh, well, I have to ask you a question. I mean, I'm always fascinated by this mythical desert island. I presume it has no electricity.
Well, I guess you could ask for electricity, couldn't you?
Well, if there's electricity, that would be the first thing. And then I suppose the second thing would be my iPhone. Not that I use it for making telephone calls very much, but I love the music which is on the iPhone. That's what I use it for. And I think having a library of music would be very, very important to me. But I think you should disqualify that answer, because I don't imagine that many desert islands actually do have electricity. So I just have to ask you one other question before letting you know what my 3 things are. How big is the island? How long would it take, for example, to walk round the perimeter of the island?
You can tell you're a management consultant by background, Richard. But it's as big as you want it to be.
All right, then in that case, I will have a bicycle as one of my things. If it's big enough to cycle round, a cycle is essential for sanity and also for exercise. So I'd certainly have a bicycle. And the second thing which I'd like to have is a house and a garden. So a very nice house and a very nice garden. So then that would be terrific. I don't want to be bumming on the beach, thank you. And then the third thing I think would be not the collected works. I would say Edward Gibbon's magisterial work from the late 18th century, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I remember reading that one when I was 18 years old, and it absolutely inspired me with the breadth of the vision and indeed the very strong wit, very, very dry wit, and the fantastic construction of the language, where Gibbon has very, very long sentences with lots of sub-clauses, but he never loses the thread in that. And of course, the Roman Empire, absolutely fascinating, and lots of parallels with today's world. So
absolutely.
I couldn't wish for a better book, and I strongly recommend the book to anyone who is locked down at the moment. It's a fantastic, very long read, and very, very satisfying read.
Super. Your biggest idol as a child?
Well, I didn't really have one, Oz. I mean, there was someone who helped me and gave me a lot of hope. And I don't think I'm that unusual in this, because we tend to remember some of us as teachers who believed in us and were, instrumental in perhaps sparking curiosity and sparking a bit of self-belief in us. And I was a difficult child. I was reckoned to be relatively backward. I don't think I was backward, because one of the things which I did was to invent my own little language. But I was a very lonely little boy, and isolated, I suppose. And there was a teacher in my first school. Well, I suppose I went to school when I was 5, 6 years old. And I can still remember the guy's name, and I can still picture his face, Mr. Toy, spelt, I even know how to spell it. It had an E at the end, T-O-Y-E. And I think if it hadn't have been for him, I would never have been any good at school. And so I owe him a great deal. I'm sure that he's dead now, but perhaps someone listening to this will remember who Mr. Toy was. Mr. Toy from North London, a very long time ago. But anyway, I'm very grateful to him.
It's interesting, the whole idol concept. It is all about the amount of self-belief those idols give you, actually. So that's a great answer. Thank you, Richard. Favourite annual event?
Well, it would have to be the Cheltenham Festival, the horse racing festival at the beginning of March each year, because the atmosphere there is fantastic. I'm a great fan of horse racing. I don't go horse racing as much as I'd like, because I'm very rarely in the UK, and I think the UK is a place where I like to go for my racing. The Cheltenham Festival, as many listeners will know, is quite unlike any other horse race meeting that I've ever been to anyway, in that it is almost, the flavour of it is strongly influenced, perhaps even dominated, one might say, by the Irish people who come. And they come over from Ireland, and they are such a mixed bunch of people. I remember being struck the first time I went to the festival by the number of nuns. And you wouldn't have thought that nuns in their habits would be great fans of horse racing, but my God, they are. At least they are when they come to Cheltenham. And it's such a wonderful atmosphere, and it's an excuse, obviously, to drink a lot and to bet a lot and all the rest of it. But most of all, to talk. I mean, it's a fantastic collection of people. So, and the racing is fantastic as well. So yes.
And we'll come back to this one later as well, given how much you move with the sun. Favourite place on earth, Richard?
Oh, it would have to be where I'm doing this podcast from, which is my home in the Algarve in Portugal. I think Portugal's a wonderful country, very nice people, fantastic food. It's not the most grandeur, doesn't have huge mountains, but it has lots and lots of very nice hills. And for someone who is English, it has country lanes, which you don't get, for example, in neighbouring Spain, because the Portuguese are a little bit like the English. They tend to be very independent. They tend to like their own place, and they are not particularly gregarious. The Spanish are always gregarious, and they love to be where lots of people are. So even if they can't live in a large city, they tend to congregate in their own particular districts. What's the name that they use for the places where people go in Spain? I'm just asking my colleague here who's. No, anyway, there's a word for it, and someone will come up with it. But the
Botellón?
Sorry?
Botellón?
No, it'll come back to me in a minute. But the thing about the Portuguese is that because they like being in small places, there are loads and loads of small villages. And of course, if you have a small village, you have to have a lane which connects it with other small villages and with towns. So I particularly enjoy cycling here because you can go on roads where there's almost no traffic, particularly these days, of course. But you get these fabulous lanes, and you can get the lanes alongside orange groves, as I call them, basically orange orchards. and all that you can see when I go on some of my rides is actually the sea and the oranges and people's houses as well, and the occasional person. So I love Portugal, and I love the Algarve, and it has probably the nicest weather in the world for year round, although as I think we might touch on later, I like the sun, and at the moment it's raining, so it's a very green place.
I'm guessing with the COVID pandemic on at the moment, it's been a deliberate choice you heading back to the Algarve?
I was actually in Australia, and I got back with about 12 hours to spare before the shutters came down, before the flights stopped, and all the rest of it. Yes, it's a very nice place to be.
Thank you very much, Richard. So, Richard, I'm tremendously excited that you have a new book coming out soon with a massively bold title. If you want to go ahead and share what that's called.
Unreasonable Success and How to Achieve It. Unreasonable,
Brilliant.
Not reasonable success, unreasonable success.
Unreasonable success, fantastic. And now, over the years, I've been pretty happy with Earl Nightingale's definition that success is the progression of a worthy ideal. But building on that, and the title of your new book, Richard, how would you define unreasonable success?
Actually, I've got a definition at the beginning of the book. I put a fake dictionary definition in, and it has 4 meanings, unreasonable success. And I'll see if I can remember what the 4 meanings are. Unreasonable success usually has all 4 attributes, or at least 3 of them. And the first one is such success in changing the world that it might seem unreasonable for any individual to have such impact. I've always been struck by the amazing fact that individuals can make such a huge difference at a grand level or at a micro level as well. And that seems to me to be the unique glory of our species. So it's the impact of individuals, and unreasonable success means that some people, for whatever reason, and I explore the reasons in the book, have a degree of impact on their world, which might be good impact or bad impact, or indeed morally indifferent impact, but nevertheless can achieve a fantastic amount. Obviously, not many people do this, but it fascinates me when they do. So that's the first definition. The second is success that's unexpected and was not predicted early in the career of the individual. And one of the amazing things, I've selected 20 people in the book that I think changed the world in some way. And those 20 people, almost none of them were favoured in terms of their background. There were actually 2 who were, but the other 18 came from nowhere. And what interests me is, why are people who don't start with a great background or, come from obscurity, why are they successful? How do they manage to become successful? After they become successful, it appears to be inevitable, but of course it wasn't. And so that's another important aspect of unreasonable success. Thirdly, success that goes well, I love this one, success that goes well beyond what the individual's skills and performance seem to warrant. I don't believe that successful people really deserve their success. Of course, in some ways they do. And every successful person, almost every successful person, believes that they're successful because they're a genius and they're wonderful and all the rest of it. If you actually study the history of any really remarkably successful person, you see that there are what appear to be huge elements of luck and chance in their careers, and they often get a break in their career that couldn't have been expected, couldn't have been planned, but which makes all the difference. One of the things which does amaze me is that it's not about performance. And I think that's very hopeful for everyone. It's not about our performance. The people who were incredibly successful, who are in my book, with 1 or 2 exceptions, they actually were not as good in many ways on conventional criteria as their peers. They were not as competent, they were not as brilliant, and so on and so forth. But somehow, and that's the mystery of the book, somehow they were successful almost beyond what they deserved, if you want to put it that way. And then the fourth attribute, which I think is hugely important, is that their success was all based on leaps of intuition rather than on logic and reason. In other words, they were lucky because they were highly intuitive, and that is something which I explore in the book. And intuition is not random, though. Intuition comes from a deep knowledge of a very narrow sphere, usually, and there are various other attributes of intuition. Using one's unconscious mind to the full is the key to that, I think. And there are examples in the book of people who were incredibly gifted because they were intuitive, not because they were brilliant. Albert Einstein's one of those, actually. I mean, everyone thinks he defines genius. Well, you know, when you look at his school record, it wasn't very good indeed. Early on, he was very weak in mathematics. You'd think to be a brilliant physicist, you'd need to be a genius at maths. Albert's maths were very poor, and he relied on his girlfriend, effectively his wife, to help him with his mathematical calculations. He failed to get into the Polytechnic in Zurich on his first attempt, and the Polytechnic was by no means the best school in Zurich. So, you know, it's quite interesting that the genius of Einstein was the leaps of imagination which he made, and there were very good reasons for that. They were not random, but the intuition is often part of the answer in explaining why people who on the face of it shouldn't have been very successful actually were. Sorry if that's a long definition, long answer to your short question.
No, perfect. So, you know, I'm going to move on to the subtitle of the book, and I think you've answered some components of this next question. So the subtitle of the book is How to Achieve It, and without giving too much of the book away, what are the key characteristics, habits, and attributes that make individuals unreasonably successful based on your research? So, you know, serendipity was there, leaps of intuition were there.
Yes, I mean, it's a book about individual success. And I was sort of fascinated by, in fact, put onto this by Malcolm Gladwell, another more eminent author, a more successful author than me. But he wrote a book called Outliers. And he tries to explain why individuals are so successful. And that's my mission as well. And he came up with a theory, which is an interesting theory and which definitely works in some cases, which was that these people who were successful very early in their career were exposed to a huge amount of experience in a fast-growing new field. And so, for example, he takes the Beatles as an example, and he says that they were a mediocre high school group, effectively, in Liverpool. But what happened to them was that they happened to go to the strip clubs of Hamburg, and they had to play 7 days a week for 8 hours a day. And so they accumulated a huge amount of experience in the new emerging field of rock and roll music, or pop music, mutating from rock and roll. And he quotes John Lennon, who says, we couldn't help getting better because we played so much and we had so much experience. And he takes the case of Bill Gates, who happened to go to a posh school in America where they had a computer at the time that nobody else had computers. And he spent hours and hours on the computer and therefore learnt how to code it and learnt about software and all that sort of stuff. And that, from that, he drew out the thesis that you need 10,000 hours of experience, which is sort of basically 10 years' work's worth in a new expanding field. The trouble with that explanation is it doesn't work for a lot of cases.
Yep,
and so,
agreed.
so my challenge was, can I come up with something which does work in the vast majority of cases? Now, I had to qualify it and say that I was talking not just about success, but about a high degree of success, unreasonable success, which makes it a bit easier. And what I did was to go through the cases of all of the very, very successful people whose life stories I knew very well, either because, for one reason or another, I'd learned quite a bit about them and I was fascinated by them, or in some cases because I actually knew them. And so what I did was to say, what were the reasons that these, perhaps in many cases unpromising people, actually were so successful? And I went through about 30 or 40 reasons, possible reasons. And if it didn't work for nearly all of these 20 people or for all of them, I discarded it. And then I was left with 9 attributes, which I made a little map out of. And I sort of imagined that they were visiting these landmarks, like being on a treasure hunt or something like that. And so I came up with these 9 landmarks, and then each chapter in the book, in the main part of the book, is actually devoted to one of these landmarks. And the landmarks really fall into 2 different types of category. There are what I call the attitude issues, which are not conventional, everyone says that you should be positive and all the rest of it. No, it's much more specific than that. For example, self-belief, absolutely crucial. For some reason, these people, rightly or wrongly, and in many cases really wrongly, came to acquire a very high degree of self-belief. It didn't happen immediately. It wasn't something they were born with in most cases. But somehow, because of the way that they figured the world worked, and somehow because of some experiences that they had, or maybe just because they were very unusual sort of people, they came to have a very high degree of self-belief. And in the book I explore, how it's possible for people to do that and come up with some pointers for people who don't start with a very high degree of self-belief as to how they might develop that. Another of those attitude things is high expectations. Just expecting a lot from other people as well as from yourself. It's very unusual. And there are some people in the book who make a whole career out of that, such as Jeff Bezos, who basically his whole career has been based around this idea of high expectations for himself and for other people, which doesn't make him an easy boss to work for. Steve Jobs is another case in point. But these people expected the earth and more than that from their people, and somehow they managed to get it. And if you couldn't meet those expectations, you were ruthlessly cut out of the team or the organisation. And because people who have high expectations are quite unusual, and if you have someone in a team who doesn't share those high expectations, they can ruin the whole thing. And likewise, if you get someone who is willing to adapt to what the team has in terms of high expectations, then they don't have to start with them. They basically fall into the culture and they adapt to it. But in a way, you want people who are willing to go with the flow rather than everyone says, well, actually what you want is mavericks. Well, in some cases you do, but in many cases that actually is poison. So that's another one of the attitudes. And I'll just mention one of the others, which is thriving on setbacks. The characteristic of nearly all of the 20 people that I identified was that they were failures. They were complete failures in some cases, and but somehow they managed to pick themselves up and have another go and have another go and have another go, and eventually they were successful. And it takes a certain sort of person to do that. But I'm also very interested in how you can actually develop that as a skill. And it's a little bit related to one of the people that I admire from a writing point of view is the guy who wrote the book Anti-Fragile and Black Swan and all the rest of it.
Yeah, great books.
Yeah, and one of Nassim Taleb's sort of, key ideas is that you don't just want to be resilient, you actually want to be anti-fragile, which means that you like being broken in a way. He says that the excess energy generated from failure is often what causes success, and I think that's very, very true. And the prime exhibit A in this case, my lord, is actually Winston Churchill, who was a complete failure at just about everything for 40 years. And many times he was completely washed up he ended up in the late 1930s in almost complete despair, completely isolated by his colleagues, drinking very heavily, more heavily than even his general achievement. I love the quote from Churchill, which says, "I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me," and he certainly lived by his dictum there. But he was right about one thing that nobody else got right, which was that Adolf Hitler was a menace to the planet and had to be stopped before it was too late. And he was warning what Hitler was doing. Everyone else was saying, "Oh, no. He says he's got no more territorial ambitions. We can believe him. We've been to talk to him. He's a quite reasonable chap. He's a vegetarian. He's a wonderful chap." But Hitler knew what was going to happen, and people remembered that in 1940. And when Britain was already at war, there was no choice. If you wanted someone who was going to take on Hitler, there's only one person in the world who fitted the job description. So Churchill, who was this guy who had monumental failures to his name, including terrible military failures in the Dardanelles and earlier in the defence of Belgium in 1914. This guy was, you wouldn't touch him with a barge pole, particularly in matters related to military affairs. He basically antagonised the miners and helped to cause the general strike in 1926 and took a hugely unpleasant view of that. He alienated organised labour. He resisted the giving of a relatively modest amount of self-government to India in the 1930s. He thought that Gandhi was not quite as bad as Hitler, but a menace to the planet as well. And the guy's judgment was awful. I mean, he was a fantastic orator, but everything came together in 1940, and no one else could probably have defeated Hitler. And that was a massive achievement for a massive failure. So, that thriving on setbacks was almost the motif, and had to be the motif, because even in the 1930s, even when he was really, really depressed, Churchill still believed that he could stop Hitler, and still believed that had to be done, and felt a transcendent calm, he says, when he was appointed Prime Minister, because he knew that he could do it, and that nobody else could. So that's another of the sort of attitude things. And then,
from what I've read,
go ahead,
Richard.
please.
One thing he absolutely had, Churchill, was the ability to rest and recover and just move himself away from things completely. And that's almost kind of like the art of meditation, isn't it?
No, absolutely. Well, he also had the common sense to, when he was sort of banging his head against a brick wall, to stop and then go do something different. So he was a military failure as a general in 1914 in defending Antwerp. But when Antwerp had fallen to the Germans, always the Germans, isn't it? When it had fallen to the Germans, he decided to get out of politics, stop being effectively the head of the Navy, and he went to the trenches for 6 months. And that seems a very counterintuitive thing to do. So he was. I think he was a major, sort of not a particularly important person in it, and it just revived him. He found the companionship. He found the just the unifying fact of which many people commented on. If they didn't get killed, they formed friendships which lasted for life. Because when you're under that kind of pressure, the other people alongside you are hugely important. He appreciated that, and it just revived him entirely. And then in the late 1920s, he was excluded from the government, and he almost went bankrupt after the Wall Street crash in 1929, and he had to keep ahead of his creditors. Well, what he did was he went off and did a lecture tour in the United States. A grueling lecture tour. It didn't go very well in some ways, because he got run over by a car in Fifth Avenue in 1930, and he had quite serious injuries. But he sort of, he bounced back, as you said. He bounced back. He continued the tour. He got back to Britain bruised and battered a couple of years later. But nevertheless, he'd done something different, and it had taken his mind off the failures, and he managed to stay ahead of his creditors as well. So, it's just incredible that, it's a good tactic. If you have a disaster, go and do something different. That's my conclusion from that one. But anyway, I was going to say that there are some of these attributes which are questions of attitude, but not as conventionally defined. And then there are strategies that people do. And in many cases, they just stumbled across these strategies. They weren't deliberate. They were reactions to events. And one of the strategies which was common, I discovered, to nearly all of my 20 people was that at some stage in their life, they had what I called a transforming experience. Transforming experience meaning that they went into something which changed them, made them different. And it could be a company, it could be an experience, in one case in a concentration camp, in another case the hanging of an older brother completely transformed the man who became Lenin. And it's an experience which changes people and gives them some insight or some rare skill or some determination. And that experience in business is very often going to work for a very unusual company which knows something that other people didn't know. And that was the case for me in my career when going to work for the Boston Consulting Group and for Bain & Company, when business strategy had just been invented. And, these firms actually had a belief in the concepts that they used, particularly the growth share matrix, which I think is just a work of beauty and art and so on and so forth, on which I based the STAR principle and various other strategies.
One of the greatest books ever written, Richard, I have to say.
Thank you, Oz. I mean,
to say that seriously.
No, I think it is a very good book, but it's only a very good book because of the power of the concept, which says basically, if you want to be successful as a business, you've got to be dominant in your own particular market or niche, and you've got to be in a very high growth market. Well, it doesn't take a genius to work out whether or not any individual business qualifies that, and most, of course, don't. But the few that do are going to be very, very successful, and it just amazes me that people.
I've got to say, it's made me personally quite successful in terms of the things I've endeavoured to achieve. Had a massive impact on my life, and I think it should be on everyone's bookshelf, actually. So if people don't have it, buy a copy now.
The STAR principle, yes. Thank you for the advertisement. That's very kind of you, Oz. But go back to the transforming experience. People don't realise, for example, that Jeff Bezos went to work for D.E. Shaw and Company, which was a hedge fund, when he was 26 years old. He'd been working on Wall Street, absolutely despised and disliked the horrible people who were working in conventional investment banks. And a headhunter sent him to go and talk to David Shaw, who'd started a sort of countercultural kind of investment organisation. And, it wasn't sort of, people didn't turn up to work in sort of sharp suits and pink shirts or anything like that. They came in jeans or shorts and T-shirts. And for the first 3 years of the life of D. Shaw and Company, it was housed on top of a Marxist bookshop in the West Village. I mean, it was different. But the thing about it was very highly quantitative. And David Shaw had been a professor of finance somewhere. And they knew something that other people at that time, and this was the early and mid 1990s, not very good at centuries, 1990s, and they knew that the internet was going to be massive and that it was going to be massive commercially, which other people just didn't realise in 1992 or 1993. And David Shaw and Jeff Bezos were kindred spirits. They were both off the scale bright. They were both introverts. They were both incredibly determined to be successful. And David Shaw and Bezos worked together on a project which they called the Everything Store. And the whole idea of it was that they would sell everything through the internet. And the first category that they would sell would be books. Now, that's Amazon, and basically David Shaw was going to start this business and wanted Bezos to be the head of this business within D.E. Shaw and Company. But Bezos said, no, I actually want to go and do it myself. And quite amazingly, David Shaw let him go and do that. He didn't sue him. He said, oh, good luck to you and all the rest of it. He took him for a walk in Central Park, tried to dissuade him and get him to do it within D.E. Shaw and Company. But Jeff said, no, I want to do it myself. Started it in his garage, and everyone knows what happened. But how extraordinary. If there had been no D.E. Shaw and Company, there would have been no Amazon. And you and I would not have heard of Jeff Bezos. Unbelievably lucky in a sense, but unbelievably good in another sense, because his formula, which was unbeatable prices and fantastic customer service, is what has defined Amazon. Makes it a very hard place to work, but it's a jolly good idea, and a style business to boot. But nevertheless. If he hadn't have had that experience, he wouldn't have been successful. And likewise, Steve Jobs. I mean, Steve Jobs achieved a great deal, inventing the Macintosh and all the rest of it, but he got thrown out of his company. Again, you recognise some of these themes of a massive setback for a man who thought he was one of the enlightened ones. He'd started the bloody company, and he got thrown out of it effectively by someone who had worked for Pepsi, and he thought of himself as a brilliant marketeer, and he was a brilliant marketeer. But basically he knew nothing about computers. He knew everything about fizzy drinks, and so he was thrown out of his company. How did he get back? It was a series of accidents that happened in the 1995, 1996, 1997. And he just basically took a huge opportunity which presented itself to go back to Apple when Apple was about to go bankrupt. And you can see that was his transforming experience. It was those events that happened in the mid to, as I say, between 1995 and 1997, where he had founded a company which for reasons shouldn't have been successful, but was very successful, which then was bought by Apple, and that brought him back into the fold. Anyway, that's a fascinating story and all the rest of it. But the point about transforming experience is not that these people set out to have transforming experiences. They happen by accident. For my readers, however, for anyone who's thinking about their career and does want to be unreasonably successful. You have to have a transforming experience. There's no way around it. You are not going to be exceptionally successful unless you have one. So if you haven't had one, you've got to think about how to engineer that. And none of the people in my book engineered it, planned their transforming experiences, but readers can. So I hope that there'll be a lot more unreasonably successful people. And there are various other strategies which were followed by the people that I describe in the book. So
these are amazing narratives, Richard. How close do you think you've come to finding the silver bullet for the psychology and road to success then?
Well, it sounds very immodest, Oz, but I think I've got it. I think I've done what Malcolm Gladwell didn't do. I'd quite like to sell more copies of books than he's done. So yes, I think it could be incredibly successful. But book publishing is such a crapshoot. It's in the lap of the gods, and I may be completely delusional, But I think anyone who's interested in being outrageously successful, unreasonably successful, whatever you want to call it, should buy a copy of the book. Not only that, I think it's very interesting. I mean, it's just studying these people's lives.
Yeah,
I got a great kick out of it, and I would. Marie Curie is another one. I would say, well, what was her transforming experience? Very, very interesting. She had her transforming experience, and I got very excited about it. Her transforming experience was meeting Pierre Curie, who was actually a professor keyed into the magic circle of physics and chemistry in Paris in the mid 1990s. So it seems that everything happened in this was the 1890s. I say I'm not very good with everything seems to happen in the 90s, whether the 1890s or the 1990s. And it was a love affair, but it was it made her respectable because there was this sort of model accepted within scientific circles in Europe at that time, which was a husband and wife team. And women, of course, had a really tough time trying to make progress in any sphere at that time. But if they were part of a husband and wife team, they were respectable. And therefore, she was a much, much better physicist than Pierre Curie, who was pretty good himself. She was highly intuitive, like Einstein as well. And she discovered radium and radiography and all that sort of stuff. She saved an estimated 1 million lives in the First World War by having mobile radiography units which would go to the battlefields, x-ray people, and then see where bullets had lodged, and therefore the surgeons knew where they should take the bullets out. I mean, it's a quite extraordinary story of a woman. Wow. But it wouldn't have happened because she was planning to go back to her native Poland before she met Pierre. And just the fact of meeting him and falling in love with him gave her access to laboratories and gave her access to other people who were the experts in that very fast developing field of chemistry at the time, where people were intrigued by the characteristics of uranium. And she found that, in fact, it wasn't uranium, it was actually radium, which was 900 times more radioactive than uranium. And so, it wouldn't have happened if she hadn't met him. She'd have gone back to Warsaw. She'd have been, she couldn't get a job as a professor in Poland because it was impossible, because it was ruled by the Russians, who didn't let women go to university. And so, if she had not met this man, probably radium wouldn't have been invented, or certainly wouldn't have been invented very quickly, or discovered rather, not invented. But it's quite an extraordinary story. That was her transforming experience, and so on and so forth. It's just amazing that all of these people did have a transforming experience.
Richard, you're hugely successful. What was your transforming experience?
Going to work for the Boston Consulting Group was my transforming experience. I mean, it was just getting access to those concepts. And, I believe in concepts. I think concepts are behind success in business as in everything else. So understanding those concepts and the power of those concepts enabled me to be one of the founders of another consulting firm, which I think was my breakthrough achievement. And you say I've been amazingly successful. I'm sort of, I don't think I've been unreasonably successful. I think that's still to come, if it's going to come at all. I'm a niche player. I'm a niche player. I've written a couple of books that have been very successful. I've helped to found a consulting firm which has, been very, very successful, but it's not McKinsey, and it's not the Boston Consulting Group, and it's not Bain & Company. So I think I'm a sort of middling successful person, but I want to be unreasonably successful. So maybe you'll help me.
And has the slant, have you gone down more of a psychology slant now compared to your other books, just listening into what you have to say here? How is this different to the books you've written in the past in the main?
Yes, I think. Well, I think it's partly psychology, but it's partly history. Actually, I mean, I've just done a historical study of these people and isolated the reasons for their success. And the thing about these 20 people is that these 9 landmarks that I describe are all the same. You know, it's extraordinary that nearly all of them had, shared these 9 attributes, which aren't really attributes. They're things that happen to them rather than things that they made happen in many cases, like the transforming experience. So, yes, I'm interested in that. But I'm also particularly interested in the unconscious mind. And that's one of the, effectively, intuition is one of the landmarks as well. Somehow each of these people got a bee in their bonnet about something. And if you track back to it, a lot of it was intuitive rather than reasonable. So, yes, if that's psychology, that's psychology. But I mean, the thing about the unconscious mind is nobody really knows what it is. Nobody knows what consciousness is. I mean, it's extraordinary. Absolutely. I mean, neurologists have made great discoveries in the last 20 or 30 years, and I've read a lot of the research, but they can't answer basic questions like what is consciousness, where does it come from, where does intuition come from? Yeah. And again, the historical approach is important. There's a book by a woman called Nancy Andreessen, which I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in this area. It's called The Creative Brain. And what she's discovered is that composers like Mozart and Tchaikovsky and scholars, academics like Henri Poincaré, who was a mathematician in Paris in the 1890s and the 1900s and all the rest of it, one of the most brilliant academics and very, very, he knew Einstein, and he was mates with all of those sort of people, a very, very intuitive man, all of those people. And it applies to poets like Coleridge in the 1820s, writing a poem called Kubla Khan, which apparently came to him in a dream. And he said all he had to do was to sit down and write it. There are just so many stories of really creative people whose stuff came to them, inspiration. I mean, in our own time, J.K. Rowling sat on a train, which was not moving. It was between Manchester and London for 4 hours. She sat on the train and she had a kind of vision of Harry Potter. She didn't know his name. She saw that he was on a train. He was going to a wizard school. He didn't know that he was a wizard. He was a scrawny little kid, and she saw it all. And she, when she got back to London, she started to write her notes up. She didn't have a pen or anything on the train. It's a vision. And these stories are just almost unbelievable, but they're so common if you actually look at highly creative people, that you realise that these people thought of themselves as being sort of note takers from some other force, and no neurologist can tell you how that happens. And in fact, and most neurologists are slightly offended by this because it's kind of like an X factor, which, explain to me how Mozart got some of his music, which he says, just basically he saw the whole thing. And it's the same story. All he had to do after dreaming it was to write down the notes. It's almost unbelievable.
A fantastic book on this is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. I don't know if you've picked that up at all.
No,
it definitely has a lot of kind of the latest neuroscientist thinking and why we sleep. So does the subconscious and the unconscious form a big part of your book?
It's one of the 9 landmarks, effectively, for intuition. Yeah. So it's 1/9 of it, effectively.
And there's tools of how to utilize that then within the book itself.
Yes. I mean, I've also got a very good sort of further reading section, and that is the thing which I recommend. Basically, a lot of the books that I recommend reading relate to that chapter because I think that's great. What's the name again, please?
Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. Probably the most impactful book I read last year, actually.
Okay. Well, again, I now recommend that to listeners to this podcast. Thank you, Oz. I've never heard of it. I mean, isn't that fascinating? There are always people who, not necessarily terribly well known. Has it been a huge hit? Or
I think it's been a blockbuster, and within the book he talks about things like how somebody can practice and practice and practice the piano notes, and they'll keep missing a specific note, but then they'll go to sleep. They may play it in the head before going to sleep, but when they wake up the next day, they can play it perfectly. And that's the subconscious mind at work a lot of the time.
Fantastic. Well, there's hope for me then. I wanted to be a concert pianist when I was 16. And my music teacher told me I was no good. Well, no, he didn't say I was no good. He said, you're good, but you're not good enough. And so you might say that was a bit cruel, but it meant that I didn't waste my time trying to be a concert pianist. But maybe that's my next career.
The science they've got to now, I was quite surprised that there was that much information. So I think you'll enjoy it, Richard.
Okay, thank you.
Just moving on then, if that's okay. So your book sounds absolutely fantastic. When's it being published?
August the 13th. It was going to be the 11th of June, but because of the virus, it's been put back because a lot of booksellers are closed or nearly closed. So August the 13th, and it will be published.
And how big are you going on the launch, Richard? Are you going to be doing launch events in the UK?
As you might imagine, Oz, I'm quite evangelical about this. I'd love to do a lecture tour and all the rest of it, and I would be happy to go, to Asia, to America, to Australia, to various other places, Europe, obviously. But it depends on the book being a great success. There's no point in pushing water uphill, which is another one of my themes based on the 80-20 principle that there's no point unless the book, it sells very well to start with, because tour organisers are not interested, the best ones anyway. So we'll just have to wait. So, please people, buy the book and give it away to a lot of your friends. And if you think it's good, please, when you've read it, tweet about it or tell your friends and all the rest of it. Because I do think it's a very helpful book. It's a helpful book for anyone who wants to be really, really successful. And also, even for people who don't care about success, the stories in it are absolutely fascinating. They're not stories I've invented. I've just studied the history of these people.
So I want to move on to you, Richard. And you've obviously had a really bright sort of career and life. Let's start off with your lifestyle, Richard. You seem to be a bit of a sun seeker and have a sunshine-filled life. Every time I email you, you're somewhere else like South Africa, New South Wales, Portugal, Gibraltar, to name just a few. What did it take you to achieve and decide on a work-life balance and the movement that you have now?
It was just a decision. I mean, obviously, you need to be financially independent to have homes in different places, but actually you don't these days. You can go and stay in places on Airbnb. So maybe I'm wrong about that. I mean, it helps to have money, but what you really need is a determination to pursue the life that you want. And that's basically what I did. I did at LEK for 6 years, and I was still in my 30s. And I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not, for 10 or 15 years, I'd done what many people do, which is I'd worked 80 hours a week, 6 days a week, probably. Sorry, what did I say? I'd worked very, very hard, very long anyway. And I said, I'm not going to do that anymore. And, I said, I don't like it when I can't go outdoors and play tennis or ride my bicycle or walk with a dog or whatever. So I'm going to be in places that are sunny. It's just a decision that you make. And if you make that kind of decision, you can live by it. And that has made me a lot happier. Most people don't care about the weather. I mean, all the psychological surveys show that people who live in sunny places are not happier than people who don't. And I think that's because they've always had it and they take it for granted. But I do think it's true that particularly if you're a Brit who grew up where the weather isn't fantastic, and you go somewhere...
I live in Manchester.
Well, you showed me a nice picture of Manchester. It looked really sunny and nice the other day. So, of course, there are exceptions. And, of course, it's not the most important thing for most people. But it's for superficial people like me, it's pretty important. You just have to decide to do what you want to do. And most people just don't think about things like that. Most people just sort of take, they do what they've always done or their friends and neighbours have always done. Also, we're going to have to wrap this up because I have a rule that I shouldn't talk for more than an hour or whatever. I think I get a bit boring after that. But so if you've got any other questions, we can just have another couple of minutes if there's anything else you want to finish with.
Let's do some quick fire ones then. So if you could have a huge billboard with anything on it, getting a message out to millions, what would it say?
Well, this one's very, very easy because, in fact... at the beginning of my book, I've got 3 quotes. I want 3 billboards, please. The first one, which is kind of a bit related to the book, is the future is a land of which there are no maps. The future is a land of which there are no maps. And it's kind of a bit ironic because I've given people a map of the future in my book. But of course, the person who said this is absolutely correct, A.J.P. Taylor, the historian, Alan Taylor. The future is a land of which there are no maps, which means that you have to create your own future, basically. It's not there, it's basically, it's all up for grabs. One of the people that Taylor studied, and one of the people who's one of the 20 very successful people, is Otto von Bismarck, who was the most successful, I believe, European statesman of the 19th century. He reunified Germany, which before he did that was a collection of small states, mainly small states, and a couple of big ones, including Prussia. But he basically changed the map of Europe, and then he kept the peace in Europe once he'd achieved his united Germany for 20 years after that. And he said something which was his whole philosophy of how to achieve things, which says, man cannot create the current of events. Man cannot create the current of events. He can only float with it and steer. So it's a nice sort of pictorial thing. On the billboard, I'd like to have someone in a canoe or something like that, because it's so true. And Bismarck was determined to reunite Germany, but he didn't know how to do it, and he just reacted to events and what events played into his hands in the late, I get the century right, 1860s. Yes, the late 1860s, when Napoleon III actually decided that he needed a success in foreign policy after some failures in Mexico and other places. And so he tried to create a war between France and Germany. The king of Prussia, William I, didn't want to go to war, but Bismarck managed to edit a response to a particular very unreasonable demand of Napoleon III. The king wrote a reply to this in what became known as the Ems telegram in 1870, saying conciliatory words and all the rest of it. Bismarck cut all of those out, sent the telegram back to Napoleon. Napoleon declared war on Germany. All of the small German states who didn't really want to be part of the greater Germany then got up in arms because it was France versus Germany. They were German nationalists themselves. And so all of those small states then agreed to send armies along with the Prussian army to defeat the French. It took a matter of weeks. This was what Bismarck had wanted to do for 10 years, and he didn't know how to do it. And somehow he just saw that this was an opportunity, this particular telegram, just editing out a few words made all the difference. Just extraordinary thing. So I like Bismarck's approach, which I call strategic opportunism, which combines two things which are generally thought to be totally contradictory. One is absolute determination about strategy, where you have iron determination to do something. But the second is being totally flexible on the means and just taking them as they come along, which was his strategy. And then the final billboard, which I want, is the Apple Think Different commercial, which they put in newspapers in 1997.
Fantastic.
The people who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones who do. and this is another theme of the book, which is that, Steve Jobs had this phrase which he lifted from Star Wars called the Reality Distortion. His view was that, nothing was impossible. If you believed that you could change things, you could change things. And again, I suppose that is related to psychology. I explore in my final chapter how you can distort reality. But it's true, most people don't think that they can change the world, and so most people don't. And as the word say, the people who are crazy enough and, deluded, they're wrong to think that they can change the world. I mean, they don't stand much of a chance, but they manage to convince themselves that it's possible, and if they do that, there's a good chance that they can change the world. So the reality, that feeds back to the first of those billboards, which is the future as a land of which there are no maps. The map has not been designed yet. You have to design your own map. So, Oz, thank you very much indeed. I think we'd better stop there. I've broken my rule.
Absolutely fantastic. So I was really excited about the book before, but now you've just blown it out of the water completely, Richard. So really looking forward to that. I just want to say that your newly launched podcast has been one of the most interesting and different on the web. If people haven't signed up to it already, it's available on YouTube and SoundCloud. Highly recommend it. So, Richard, you've been a delightful guest. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Oz. Where do I send the check to? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Okay, goodbye.